welcome back to the Information Revolution, a podcast for people who are interested in information and working with it. This is part two of a chat with a special guest here. I won't bother to introduce her as we can do the rounds. So let's jump straight in. So my name's Michael Upton. I'm an information management consultant based in Wellington, New Zealand.
And I'm Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect and I work for Metataxis in New Zealand.
And my name's Karl Melrose. I'm an information management consultant working out of South Australia.
Hey, I'm Liz Wilson. I'm an information architect currently working for a New Zealand financial institution.
So welcome back, Liz. It was a really good chat last week, I thought. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of things. One of the things I've been itching to say, which isn't, we don't need to take further, but just thinking about the structured, unstructured. And back in the day, XML was supposed to sort all of that out by allowing you to chunk up the unstructured, so that you could do more with it. And as publishers, we really did put all those little tags in that meant that you could extract content information from your documents and repurpose them so that it would look a little bit like, Wikipedia. You could pick the date out and stick it up there, and you could pick the wife out, and etc. Anyway, I just felt I really wanted to say that. It seems to have, I don't know if people are using it very much in that way these days, so maybe we could come back to that. The other thing that I was thinking leading on from that was a little bit about the containers and about, one of you said something about line of business systems and how so much is done. I think it was Carl. So much is done in line of business systems these days, which seems right, apart from maybe people in particular who are writing policy, research, that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, well, okay, so maybe then logically what can be put in a line of business system is, that makes sense to me. That's like an information set of a kind where everything relates to that particular aspect of the business, and then other things and that's more about the who, the when, the what, that kind of data driven kind of stuff, and then maybe the how and more explanatory stuff is put in another line of business system, which is the knowledge base, which explains how you do stuff. And everything goes in one of those two things. Anything that you create that's apart from that is your own business and should not be a record, because it's just you figuring out what it is you need to know, what it is you need to do, that kind of stuff. Do you see? Does that making sense? So the
Have you got a
logical
microphone you can drop, Judi?
the logical thing to that is that records are everything that's published, because all of that stuff, apart from what's your own stuff, would need to be published in the business. It would therefore need to be curated, because you can't just publish any old rubbish. It would need to be curated and governed, obviously. But it would make it But do you see what I mean? It would make people think about, what is it that other people need to know? And that needs to be published properly in this format, or else I can keep it to myself or maybe my team. Is that,
Yeah, I love
sorry?
that.
Yeah.
I love that, Judi. And I've got the perfect real life example. Some of you may know that members of my family, it's nepotism valley already, work in the medical industry. One's a doctor, one's a nurse, one's been in practice management in the US. And one of them managed to catch the last episode and said, OMG, Liz, what you said exactly works in medical records and billing records. And I said, well, tell me more, oh medical professional. And it's the fact that they have medical records which used to be very paper-based, and a doctor or a medical person would chart what had happened to a patient, symptoms, test results, activity, that kind of stuff. Now that's all sitting in medical databases. But when you are in a medical setting and someone has done something to you, or you've come and said, your medical doctor doesn't whip into the back pocket and pull out a quill and write it down as you're talking. They might make some notes, but there's often a medical student or junior practitioner who is tasked with writing up what has happened to you. Now, at the end of the day, in a hospital, for example, that person might be writing up 7, 8, 9, 10 cases. And apparently, and I'm just not making this up, but apparently copying and pasting between records is quite a thing. In fact, I'm reading an article where they say the bloating of patient records can be as much as 40 or 50% of information in any given chart is actually copied either from the same chart at a different time or from someone else's chart. And chart is just their name for the text record. So
I
when
mean,
you say...
this is why robotic process automation has absolutely taken off in medical situations, because, having a high fidelity copy from one application to another where the applications don't have a way to talk to each other.
Yeah, I
Huge
hear what you're
gains.
saying with the high fidelity, because, Control C, Control V can still lead to error. I missed the first word out. The letter was wrong. But what that means is that bad information gets perpetrated for often years and across multiple locations, because an error keeps getting cut and copied and pasted into a new record in the database. So the idea that a practitioner, when looking to see, when you said, Judi, about curation, that really rang a bell, which is who is curating this record, which is being created by a mix of medical practitioner and an administrative person, and then is just taken as a true record of what was said, done, created, tested, whatever, and then can just be mirrored and copied over and over again without due curation. Is that because of the nature of the work, then just doing it again and again and again for administrative reasons means that clinical error can easily arise? Which makes me think about all those databases, those data applications, which have the ubiquitous notes field. Because the work, oh yes, we all laugh. I laugh. But the fact that a work situation is properly mapped and understood, and then an application built to support it, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, world's changed. So now what we're interested in that wasn't in the original build gets put in the notes field. And what I'm looking at, as you say, Judi, is that world where documents or text and the data systems overlap. How do I get data out of a text thing? So essentially the notes field is a text object bunged into the middle of the database. And how do I bring that into a data environment where I can analyze it or report on it or understand it or curate it? Because a person creating a text field, when they rock up to a situation where there are customers or whatever's, tenants, I was about to say, that might be a giveaway, might not use the same words or terms as someone else turning up to the tenant next door. So how does the reporting and the analysis and the forecasting, the data science, how do they get the goodness they need out of this blobby, no, I shouldn't have said blob, that means something, out of this this chunk of text, which has been written by people. Sometimes it's actually just verbally dictated and there's text translation stuff on the way into it. Michael, have you come across this issue about where text meets data and how we get the power of a data and analysis tool out of a bunch of individual text things?
Yeah, for sure. And increasingly, I mean, I think that's all the hype around LLMs and around AI at the moment is definitely, and that's a really common use case, is how could we um, cluster sets of information to basically derive meaning out of it, or as a proxy for meaning. Um, but at a really, really basic level, one of the things I was thinking as you talked about the notes field is, I mean, so you say that it's essentially just used to kind of catch up or fill the gaps. That's almost an extension of the whole thing we were talking about last time around the difference between data and documents. What is a blank document except that notes field and none of the data? And so, you know, so although we could kind of scoff, and we did all laugh about notes fields because immediately know about the challenges that come with them. When you're starting with just a document, you know, it's like only having the notes field, having none of that other structure that can then drive reuse or drive insights. Yeah,
This
so
is
Carl.
this is half the value problem for the records management industry at the moment. There is this idea built into records management that all we have to do is go along, and when someone creates a document, we've just got to be right there and grab the document and put it somewhere so that, those irresponsible people who are trying to get things done, can't lose it or delete it or corrupt it or something like that. And I mean, that that idea is just, I think it's erroneous. I mean, and I think this is where, data management people, if you look at the way they've come at things, what's the first thing that what's the first thing a business generally builds? Does it build a data management practice, or does it build a data analytics practice? Well, it builds a data analytics practice first 99 times out of 100, because they know that they don't want to add overhead to and expense to things that aren't breaking anything. They want to get secondary value from all of this data that they've got. And the secondary value might be, a dashboard that tells people, how long is our queue for this service at the moment? We've I was going to say we've got FOIs, but let's go with that. We've got FOIs, and you know what? We know that we can handle 3 FOIs a week, and we have 37 at the moment. So we should respond to that. We should do something. We should add more resources, or another example that from a past organisation I've done some stuff with, the Premier's correspondence in South Australia, there is a clock on it. You need to respond to this stuff within 28 days. And so, you know what? They've got a whole bunch of secondary data that process creates that gives them all of the dashboards and everything else so that they know when they're getting close to the end of that clock. And data people instinctively create the secondary value first, and then they bring data management along afterwards because they get to the point where they can't trust the data they're getting anymore. They start to have problems. And, I mean, this is where I feel like data management, data people generally, and records people are kind of worlds apart in so many ways. But, you go and look at my favorite section of ISO 15489 that
We know
section
it's
7,
paragraph
appraisal.
7.
Yeah. But I mean, what does it ask you to do? It asks you to reduce business risk through using records management tools and techniques. And I mean, you know, if you need to know whether somebody has a peanut allergy, I want a box that says, does this person have a peanut allergy, and is very clearly identifiable as yes or no. That's what I want. And data people figured that out several decades ago, and they figured out that, performance is actually a risk, and we can make performance go harder if we build a business application that has the field here. So instead of somebody getting a 50-page document and going, the bit I need is on, page 17, and that's okay now because, we've invented search. And so I can hit Control F and look for the thing that I need. I mean, that's kind of the records management attitude to providing people that data. And data people build a business application and they make sure it's the first thing that people see. First bit of data you need, great. We're going to make that the first bit you see. Second bit of data you need, we're going to make that the second thing you see. I mean, eventually they get down to the notes field. But, the notes field to me is should be the source of all business process appraisal under ISO 15489. It's like, that's the bit that tells you what the current business risks are. That's the bit that somebody couldn't find a field for, but it was important enough for them to take the time to record it there, to make a record of it there so that they could fix something or do something better.
So it kind of goes back to what I was saying. I think where I was going was
It does. Tails in beautifully with
how
everything
much
you said at the
document.
start. That's why I was just punching the ceiling.
Well, that's perfect. Perfect. Um, as you've just said, data is created, hopefully, with exactly the requirements in mind. That's what you'd hope, and that's what you'd expect. But documents are just created by people all over the place. And wouldn't it be great if people thought about it more and only created exactly what's needed? So, which goes back to my idea of, could there, for that other stuff, for the stuff that doesn't go into the line of business, we need this exactly. And I mean, for Liz's example with the doctors, the patient records. I mean, my patient records have got correspondence in there attached to my patient record, as well as all the data about me. So that's perfect. That all lives in that system. Excellent. The stuff that doesn't need to be in that particular line of business system, shouldn't we be thinking more about why are we creating this? And can we create a kind of line of business system, as it were, where that stuff goes, if it's important enough for people to know about it? That's what I'm trying to say.
No,
And
I
then
really
we
like
can,
that.
yeah,
And the thing that I would say generally about that, and I'm writing a training course at the moment, um, that's got that's essentially document and content management per the DMBOK, and that authority problem is the first thing that I kind of want to explain to people. The records, non-records, I'm not so, I think everything's a record, and there are, authoritative and non-authoritative, or high, low value, or whatever your paradigm is. But that idea of authoritative and non-authoritative, I think, is super important. And I think that's part of what you're talking about, and you kept saying published. And I mean, what some of this comes down to is that I think that sort of problem is the really important stuff for records management. But it's not, oh, you created something, how do we grab it and put it somewhere? It's how do we develop a process with you so that when you produce something, we have a process here and we know you follow the process, and this is the authoritative process, and it's published. And so everybody knows what the authoritative process is. And when you produce documents, but, because of that process or whatever, documents, whatever they are, how do we know that that document is the one that has authority? And, I mean, who here has done a file server cleanup and, found that you've got 47 business units and they're relying on 15 different versions of the same document, and they're all slightly different, and it just hasn't caused a big enough problem yet for someone to do something about. I mean, like, they're the kinds of problems that we've got. And, it's interesting talking to who was it? It was a chemical stuff manufacturer. Let's just call them that. Last year, you know, they take this stuff amazingly seriously. Like, for them, that they kind of don't want to buy records management because they don't think it has anything to say about this. But, you talk to them about document control, and oh my God, they are so on top of that and so anal retentive about it, because you know what? If somebody uses the wrong document, there could be a very large explosion, at one of
yeah.
their plants. And that's, that's the very thin end of the wedge, in terms of problems. But those types of authority problems with documents roll back through organizations to all kinds of places. I've got a couple of, yeah, anyway, we could talk a lot about the problems that, people picking up the wrong definition or using the wrong project document or those kinds of things cause.
One thing around that kind of concept of controlled documents and so forth, um, it was on my mind when you were first sort of describing your sort of vision, Judy, if you like. And I was thinking that I think that's the one exception where I really think there is that value of kind of pulling, like making sure you got the right thing and then capture that thing and put it somewhere and have it together. Like, and you might do that in some virtual sense, it might not be a literal thing of picking something up and moving it around, but actually, we've talked before, challenges for most of us in our work lives are to do with having too much information and not being clear on which is the thing that has that authority that you described, Carl. I actually think controlled docs are that one exception where I really think it's really important that you do go and grab the thing and capture it well and put it in the right place to sort of confer status on it, like to sort of say, look, this is the important one. Yeah. I don't think that's often how people think about that sort of process of capture and the importance of capture, but I think it's one place where I've kind of like perhaps I've gone really extremely the other way of let's not worry, manage in place. Let's not try and go and grab the things. But actually, I think um, a all I'm really saying is this is another form of a publishing process that basically says we've put this through certain steps in order to achieve a business outcome. In this case, the business outcome being that everyone can rely on that as the thing that basically tells us
It's
how to do stuff.
authoritative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean,
I'll stop.
I think manage in place. Sorry, Liz, I have a tendency to talk too much, so go. You just talk over
You
me
and me
and
both, Carl.
I'll eventually stop.
Yeah, now that I'm working for a financial institution, I'm very aware of the role of the document for the customer. So we might be selling an insurance company, insurance policy. And indeed, I have just, because I've just joined this company, I have just got my health insurance membership certificate sitting beside me through the mail. And it's the same with if I enter into a contract with a bank or with an insurance company or with a car dealer. And I could say it's all online. We've talked. I've got data. I've contributed to the data. And I could create the contract that I've agreed to in retrospect. But no. And I understand why, is that they create a physical object, which is the record of the agreement, let's say. So I won't say I'm punning on the words authoritative, but it is an authority. Which then, should the S hit the fan, I turn up to a court and the court looks at that record. They don't say, "Oh, can you just pull out the data as it was? Can you just do a rollback to March 2022 when Liz signed this document? Did she sign it? Was there a fax? Did she scan it?" No, let's actually look at the copy, that I'll say the hard copy or its equivalent, to say this was the agreement that both parties actually entered into. And that's big business inside law firms, banks, insurance companies, where the agreement that we both parties looked at, and both parties went, "Yep, that's it." Though who the heck reads all the fine print? And that's the one that is the authoritative version. So I'm not just looking at how does text become utilized in a data environment like operational data, analytics, use and reuse, but how does a database actually express some element of the work process into a document, which has a different, I liked your idea, Carl, which is it has a particular status. And I think if everything's a record, but there might be different statuses, oh my gosh, of records, which are the ones that we care about. Those of you who, like me, have worked in government agencies on and off for many years, know that policy drafts are supposed to be a special status of policy advice under an Official Information Act request. But the journalists love them because that's where some rando policy analyst says, "You know what, why don't we do this?" And the minister or the senior policy analyst goes, "No, are you mad?"
Well,
But it's in version 0.113 of the policy document. Whereas the government should naturally say, "Well, look, mate, that's all policy advice. What counts is the authoritative, consulted, agreed, signed off, and published." I love the use of the word publishing, Judi, because it's something that records have always shied away from, because in publishing, we think that's book or magazine publishing and it's closer to libraries, so let's not go down that path. But I think the idea that published transmutes something from one status to the other in a really formal way. And yet, Carl, how does that work with those records which have either lower value or a different status? Can they all be records, really?
They were recorded.
Ooh,
it
is
depends
that
how
like
you want to cut it, I think.
is that nominative determinism? We did something, therefore it says something.
Well, I mean, they were recorded, and either way, there's one of the things that I think data people get that records people don't, which is very strange to me, is that records people think that records are for looking backwards, and data people understand that records are for looking forwards. You know, you don't write a contract so that you can look backwards one day and go, oh, this was the contract we signed. Those were great days. You write a contract so that everybody knows what they're supposed to do in a week's time, in a month's time, in 6 months' time. And everybody can go back to a thing and say, oh, this is what we're supposed to do. And everyone who creates a business application looks at the things that the organization needs to do in the future and looks at the data that needs to move forward in time to achieve those things and says, great, we need to put that in the business application. Records people look at things and go, oh, we better keep it just in case. And this is a fundamental problem for the records profession for me. It's one of the things we really have to move on for to re-find our value in organizations. And, you know, that contracts are an absolutely perfect example, you know. And I mean, just on the whole records front, you know, the you know, the whole draft, you know, the policy draft thing there. I mean, I think there are some comments going around on LinkedIn at the moment about FOI and those kinds of things. And I mean, I think FOI fundamentally misunderstands information seeking behavior. You know, the idea that, you know, we can just have access to everything and then everything will be great. You know, and then we'll know. I mean, that's not how people seek information, you know, and this is pretty well known. I mean, you go and talk to anthropologists about how people actually look for information, and they'll say things like, well, you know, people, you know, they go out and they look for at about 5% of all the available information, and they match a pattern and they take an action, and that's how people make decisions. And, you know, the decision to rant on social media, to vote in a particular direction, you know, to do pretty much anything is based on that idea most of the time. The number of people who will sit down and actually read through the entire corpus of stuff, very small. And I realise I've gotten off the track of the main point, but
I love it, Karl. I'm aware that when we, having started as an archivist, and you're very aware that you're looking back at 19th century New Zealand government and you think, really, that's what we said and did? And you think about any meeting that you're in, especially a decision-making meeting, and you look at the record which might actually be created nearly contemporaneously, and you go, that's not what we said. Okay, that's sort
Yeah.
of what we agreed, but that's not a true record of the meeting or the discussion. And to put a lens of a week, a year, a decade, a century, and say, oh, that's a record, and that's got some sort of verisimilitude. It's just, one, hilarious, and two, false. But the beauty of archives is that you learn it's the best that you've got. And when the best that you've got, you know, is so shoddy or unreliable, but it's the best that you've got, um, then looking into the past, even the recent past, and that's why I think data systems do think about it. They think about how are we going to do what we're going to do? Let's record what we've done, and also let's record what we're going to do next. And I think your point that data is about the future rather than documents about being the past is fair enough. No one often who goes to a document and says, "Oh, I see that 15 days ago we said that in 15 days we were going to do X." Well, unless you're a journal, the written document is never very seldom the one that you look at to say, what am I doing next? Whereas if I put a calendar note in my online calendar, and it sends me something that says, hey, Liz, 15 weeks ago, 15 days ago, you said, you know what, let's do this now. And I'm looking at it going, I have no recollection of that, but thanks for reminding me. I've also wanted to ask you, Karl, in particular, about some of your talk from last week about engagement by records people with the C-level or upper levels of organizations. And you said, get out there, talk to your business leaders, your senior people, tell them what we can do and why and how it's important. And I realized from my experience is that the C level doesn't want to talk to us. they don't even know that we've got something worth saying, because they don't think that we've got something worth saying. They don't think that they might talk to the head of IT or to the head of data. In fact, in my new organization, our entire data practice sits under data and marketing, which really puts me in my place. So that's awesome. But what happens when the C-suite, the C-level, doesn't return my calls as a records manager? How can I make myself appear relevant to even get my little tinsy foot in the little tinsy door?
It's the, it's a very big question, but I think it's the question for the industry. We were awarding the completion certificates for the RIMPA executive engagement thing that I've been building this year, and I mean that was exactly what I was trying to get across to the audience when, in the preamble to the presentations, was that if you can't get your executive to fund something, you can't do it. And the chronic thing that I get when I go and talk to practitioners is that they can't get their executives to even entertain talking to them. But the there's that, I think it was Einstein, the whole thing about insanity is continuing to do the same things over and over again and expecting different results. And I think that the problem we have is that people have a pattern of practice in their head, and they want to go and talk to their executives about that pattern of practice. And the problem that we have is that executives don't care about the pattern of practice, and they also don't care about the stories that records management tells itself about how it's important. And it has a set of those stories that basically, say, looking backwards or accountability. And, I mean, hi, I'm going to come along and I'm going to, record everything so that you can be more accountable for the things that you said you're going to do. I mean, really, who wants? That's not a story somebody wants. I mean, that's where the versions become a problem. It's like this. You go and look at a big government decision that was made, and there were 15 options considered, because a sensible policy process should include looking at options. But every single one of those options represents a change in priority in a group of people that can get angry about having something being stolen from them. And we need less. I think we need less of that, not more of it. The problem, though, I mean, people go and talk to executives about records management, and executives don't care about records management. They care about the outcomes the outcomes they need, and they care about, well, I have this program of work coming up, and there are some insoluble problems in it, and if you can bring them a solution to that, they will give you their time. They will absolutely give you their time. One of the biggest problems that we've got, though, is that a lot of records management comes from government, and we've had a compliance standard in place for a long time, and so we go to people and we say, well, invest in records management, and you'll be able to find your information faster and better and cheaper, and life will be great and you'll be more efficient and everything else. And then someone says, well, yeah, no, I really love the sound of all of that. But I mean, my experience of records management is generally that you want me to put things into this EDRMS, and I can never find anything that I put in there, and and it's not laid out in a way that makes sense to me, and and then of course you get people on the hook and they start saying, yeah, no, I really like the sound of all those things you're promising. And then you say, well, all you've got to do is just put it into the EDRMS and, structured in this way. And, we can't change the structure because the structure is based on, some destruction schedule that was created by some agency that doesn't have to deliver any of the things that we do. And so they don't care if it's going to completely get in the way of every bit of business that we try and do, because they're just trying to get their policy implemented and get their objectives met. And so what do? They go, well, this person isn't worth talking to. They didn't listen to a single thing that I said, and now I don't believe that they can deliver anything. And that sounds very critical, and it is purposefully, but we've got to start accepting that people don't want to buy the pattern of practice that we've been selling for a long time. They have stuff to do and they need help doing that stuff. And we have to also be really careful that we help people understand how we are going to help them achieve things. And we can deliver that how, because the pattern of records management practice that I've seen does not make businesses more efficient. It does not make them more accountable. It doesn't make it easier for them to find things. It doesn't make sure that evidence is more accessible. It puts so many barriers in front of all those things with the pattern of practice that people generally do something else. And so
Carl,
we've got to...
there's an old saying in New Zealand: what every records manager needs is a good disaster. It's a saying that I have been trying to get off the ground for decades. And of course, because we're often good corporate citizens, what we mean is we want a disaster in an organization like us, but not us, where we can say to our chief level something or other, look, it happened to them, it
if
could
only
happen
you'd
to
been
us.
managing your records properly.
If only they had not let the building burn down with, 50 years of colonial records in it. If only they had managed to remember to back up their this, that, and the other. Michael, you've been, if you can talk about it, recent experience over the last few years with commissions of inquiry in New Zealand. And of course, for lots of organisations, a commission of inquiry is a non-natural disaster that any government agency clearly wishes would never happen to them. But also those commissions of inquiry have been looking back through, often paper records through decades, to try and find out something that was, I'm going out on a limb here, was probably known to be the case at the time, but might have not been acted on. I'm thinking of the commissions that you might have been involved in. But now we want to act on what was recorded about what happened at the time. Have the departments and organisations you've been working with, or that you've seen as part of those commissions, been thinking about this records management as the recording of business activity from the past?
I might go slightly sideways on that one, if it's all right. What
Yes.
I would say is to take it all the way back to the start. And Judy, in the world you were describing, where there's certain kinds of things that go into lines of business, and then there's the other stuff. What was on my mind is that actually that stuff around accountability and around looking back and around telling a story is this kind of thing of trying to understand evidence of what really happened and potentially in an adversarial context, in the case of most inquiries where it's, I mean, adversarial in the sense that it's like a judge presiding, it's that kind of flavor where you basically go, right, one of us is wrong, let's go, and, find out who it is. And I think the standards around all of that stuff and the outcomes that you're trying to get to are so far from what we will often talk about when we're talking about accountability and things in a records context. And I really think um, I could almost imagine two different professions. One is around actually how do you want to manage your information to, deliver good outcomes, including, being responsible to whatever standards, I mean standard with a small s there, whatever kind of specification. And then there's this other one, which is much more just like about trying to go and find the evidence of, what really occurred and what could have been known and things like potential wrongdoing, those kinds of things. And that stuff, that's the stuff where you actually are least interested in what are normally considered the formal and high value records. Like you're most interested in basically going scratching about in the areas where people are trying not to let things be published or let things reach the light of day. And that's where I wonder whether there's kind of two things here, and perhaps we've historically distracted ourselves in terms of trying to meet this all as if it's kind of one big outcome that we're trying to get to. Perhaps that stuff around holding people to account or about evidence of basically of wrongdoing, or negligence or, whatever. I wonder if there's almost two separate sets of practices there, and we should leave leave that other stuff to the e-discovery folks.
Yeah, because I'm thinking
I
of
don't know.
the inquiry which looks back over years of state care, for example, and Carl, the name of the inquiry was the abuse of people in state care. So that's the kind of commission it was. So a lot of those clinical and care records destroyed thanks to the schedule or thanks to
Mm.
just whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So they were looking at things that might look like low evidentiary value: diaries, rosters, calendars. But there were a lot of depositions. So a lot of people said, well, actually, I remember it somewhat differently. So that sort of brings not just the digital world and the paper world and the paper equivalent digital world, but also memory and people's testimony, um, which
I
is
mean,
it is that kind of forensic fact finding through things that might have survived that transient nature of memory.
the two quick things that I'd say. Something that every records person should read before they start telling anybody what records are for is a paper from psychology, and it's called something along the lines of, uh, I think it's 7 plus or minus 2, and there's a bunch of other stuff in the title. But basically what it talks about is it talks about how on a really good day we can remember about 9 digits. On a bad day we can remember about 5 reliably. And if you look at the way memory degrades very quickly, and this is called the forgetting curve, you can Google it, the fraction of information that we forget within 24 hours is massive. Like the fact that anybody can be relied on to remember anything that happened a week ago, I mean, with any level of reliability is to me erroneous. You've just got to go and have a look at all of the research from psychology. And the thing that we find is that people may remember certain patterns, but they don't generally remember the actual thing. They get it wrong. They make it up. The thing that we need for memory to seem reliable to us is we need a coherent memory. We don't need a factually accurate one. It just needs to hang together. And that's a real problem. And that's something that records really can solve, but not records management. Being there and saying, this is what you've got to record. And the other thing that, I would have got onto if I'd stopped getting into a semi-rant before is that people need to realize that there are no records management projects. There are business projects. If you want to sit down and say, we need to remember, what happened in all these care situations with high fidelity in 10 years' time, because, we have a serious responsibility here. And at some point, someone's going to come and say, did you execute well on it? You need a project to do that. You need a project that says, we're going to go and get people to keep a specific type of record, ISO 15489, Section 7 appraisal, we need to appraise this business risk and say, we need a project to make sure that we can deliver against this business risk in the future. Or, we're going to have an earthquake and we need to make sure that we have a records management strategy to deal with the earthquake. We keep going to people and saying records management delivers all of these things, but it really doesn't. Projects with specific aims that say, this is how we do this, deliver those things, not generic patterns of practice that that hope that people are recording the right thing, recording the right facts at the time, and hoping.
A bunch of those inquiries and so forth. I mean, the kinds of evidence they're looking at, and I'll use the word evidence because I think it's a really different tradition. It's about discovery in the legal sense, or perhaps not technically, but it's about evidence, and it's about it's a different standard, and there's different characteristics to the information that you use for evidence, I think, compared to the characteristics of records that would drive business processes. Um, and I mean, take out the word business, just processes, the things that organizations are organizing, come together and do stuff. Like I guess I'm just wondering whether it's almost easiest, and I'm going to just, I don't necessarily actually mean this, but it's almost easiest just to ignore that stuff around looking back and keeping good records of those things. If we accept that all this dross that gets piled up that's outside those systems that Judi was describing at the start is perhaps the most important stuff that actually gets looked back on to kind of tell those stories in an evidential sense. Anyway, that's my random thought. I don't know if I do believe it, but I'm just thinking out loud.
I think I think so I have a couple of books about intelligence analysis and management here, as in like spycraft type stuff. And The thing that
Oh
they
yeah,
talk about is a
that kind of
process of
intelligence.
hypothesis development and, and then what evidence supports this. And, investigative processes of all kinds are the same kind of thing. We've got these things and we've got a hypothesis about what they say and what they, the fact pattern. We can hypothesize this is the outcome of the fact pattern. And then can we find things to get to a level of, beyond reasonable doubt? There you go. There's a great standard. But, I think one of the things we have to remember is that there is a limited number of things that we can record information for, a limited number of purposes.
Mm.
People who are going along every day, they are recording things so that they can get stuff done. They're not sitting down and go, no, this is not always the case, but most of the time they're recording things so they can get stuff done. They're not recording things because they want to be accountable for them in the future. They're either recording them because a piece of legislation says they have to, or they're recording things because they know that tomorrow they need to meet with someone at 1:00, and they know that if they record a calendar entry for that meeting to happen at 1:00, there's a really good chance that 2 people are going to turn up there. So when we look backwards, we're looking backwards onto things that people were creating to support a set of actions. And there is a limited number of actions that we can support. So, if we sat down and said to every business unit, every business that, you need to sit down and you need to hypothesize about 50 royal commissions that could happen in your industry, and you need to create a trail of evidence to support the evidential discovery of all of them, all those businesses would go broke the moment we imposed that requirement on them. And, they'd look at us like we were crazy, because we would be. And I think we have to remember that.
It's why I've always been drawn to the idea of medical records, actually, which is that there's a very high payoff for correctly recording what you did in any given circumstance, in the test, in the lab, in the protocol for administering drugs to someone, to how they looked or sounded on the day of the appointment. And my relative, who's the doctor, said, if you're recording something about how Liz appeared in a particular medical intervention, you'll write that down, but you do have to think ahead and say, if I'm a specialist looking back over a medical history, the things that my specialist is looking for might not be the things that my medical practitioner recorded at the time. So that's one where the idea of curation is blown away by the idea that our medical records are filled with false information thanks to copy and paste. And I'm not saying that the medical system, in terms of medical records, is in crisis, but it's a crisis that if it happens, it would affect me very personally. This is not the company might just, do 3 appendectomies a year rather than 4. This is my appendectomy. I've never had one. Don't know what I'm talking about. So the idea that recording has value depending on your context or your viewpoint. I love your example, Karl, of planning to do something, and I'm looking at, shopping list. The shopping list for the Christmas dinner is a bit different from shopping list for my next week, because honestly, if I don't buy the right things pre-Christmas, then there can be accusations of incompetence or worse flung about if we didn't buy enough cranberry sauce or gravy. In which
You wrecked
case, that
Christmas.
forensic look about what did you go to the store for, Liz, to buy. But how do we reconcile this high cost, low take up method of recording for the past and recording for the future with the fact that we've got 2 different paradigms between how do I run an organization if I've got a data environment to run it in, and the still explosion of text that we just keep collecting.
Well, I think I solved that problem for us right at the beginning, didn't I?
Yeah.
What
This is why I called it your mic drop moment, Judy.
Yeah, but your mic drop moment was that we should care about these things and we should do them properly. And if we've ever come across an organization which cares about both sides of these things and does them properly,
True.
I would like to meet that organization.
True. I was just thinking though that in the old paper paradigm, you'd have the file on, I suppose, the patient, for example, or the company that you're doing business with, the paper file, and you don't just put all your thoughts in there, probably, hopefully. You just put the important stuff in there because if it's going to be out. I'm just thinking about a government department I worked for a long, long time ago. All the files in the middle of the room, anybody can go and take one and look up, what the interaction has been with this company. You're not going to just put all your own random stuff in there. You're going to put all the stuff which has been agreed to be important. And anything that any notes you need to make for yourself, that's your business. So
I
yeah.
appreciate that, Judi, but you have just lost Microsoft lost a huge court case with the Department of Justice, who were taking them to court for antitrust behavior. Oh gosh, I hope no Microsoft person watches this podcast. I'm sure they will. And
At least one does.
the case was against, they were actively working against Netscape. Oh my gosh, nearly said Netflix, against Netscape. And so Microsoft turned up to the DOJ hearing and they hand over beautifully crafted and agreed corporate policies and positions in relationship to Netscape. And then the council says, well, can we just talk about the meeting that occurred that this minute was created for? And the council said, sure. No, we talked about it. There was words like, let's just FUCK Netscape because they're the competition. But that wasn't the agreed Microsoft policy. The agreed Microsoft policy was the one that we beautifully curated and wrote down. And the judge said,
Sure.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with you there, mate. Probably didn't use the word mate. Because the antitrust competition
Legit.
was about the state of mind of Microsoft as they proposed and carried out their policies in relationship to Netscape. And that caused Microsoft to be split into several organizations for at least a decade. I know they're back on top now, but there was a point where they must have been thinking, holy cow, is this an existential loss to us? Based on the fact that the justice system knew that it wasn't just about the carefully curated and approved document that was the record of the thing. And I hold on to that example to say it can be useful, but it's not always the whole story. And sometimes the whole
I
story
think
has to come out.
I was just going to say, when I say curation, I'm not saying you should ditch anything that's going to be massively controversial, if you see what I mean. I mean, you should put all the formal document, all the agreed things. So any records of a meeting should be there. Anyway.
One of the things that I always do is I always use tort law as an example, and particularly when people start telling me that, we can have records and non-records, because if you are sued under a tort of some kind, and, a tort is just basically a way for people to, say that you did some damage and now here is a thing that, lets me take you to court and, get some money for it. If you're sued under a tort, I mean, exactly as Liz was saying, the court does not care whether you think something was a record or what your definition of a record is, or, whether you think it's data or information or knowledge or wisdom or records or stuff or dog shit. Excuse me, might have to bleep that out, Michael. They're going to send you a discovery request that's going to say, give us everything about this. And they mean everything. And if it was recorded,
Sure.
it's in the scope. That's why I just think
Sure.
verbing it is
I mean, I
super
think,
important.
well, it totally connects back to what I was trying to get at before, that, the standards there around what gets called into scope as evidence is nothing to do with what we talk about in terms of values of curation of stuff and formalizing things and publishing of that stuff. And all I'm really wondering is, should we acknowledge that the greatest benefit we can bring is actually in that space, of I mean, it's just a different way of looking at the same thing. I think we were saying over and over, which is the value we could bring as a profession to um, business process improvement rather than the stuff around kind of serving up something for future investigation, because we actually know that those investigations, it is all the dross, it is all the stuff. And perhaps the greatest value we could add to that is simply just knowing what we could be chucking out and ought to, Jumping all the way back, I just want to say, Judy, you described that scenario of like basically, certain subsets of stuff being put on a file to do with a customer, or sorry, to do with a company, like
Yeah.
like that. That's a CRM that you just described, but
Yeah,
you
sure.
described it back in the days of paper, and so I guess it's just interesting to note that a bunch of those practices and things that used to be considered valuable for us to get involved in are those things that have moved into line of business processes now, or line of business systems now. So a CRM would be a classic example where you have a bit of a split in the profession where some people would be like, yep, I'm all about that. I want to be all over it. And others would say, oh, no, that's not my bag. I just look after the RMS and some paper filing.
I think it is worth piping up
Go
to
on,
say
Liz.
I think the profession of records management is in real trouble and is about to become irrelevant, especially if data management manages to take on some of our key concepts.
Okay.
Yes,
I agree.
couldn't have said it
Yeah,
better myself.
I think.
The key concepts are still as relevant and as important as ever, but the pattern of practice has to deliver on them better than the competing alternatives.
I reckon
Okay.
that's a great point to wrap it up on. So
Yeah.
thanks very much for joining us again, Liz, and we'll catch everyone in a future episode. Cheers.
Yep.
See ya.
Thanks. Bye.
Hooray!